Dr. Hendren, I'll start with you. You mentioned my hometown of Provo, Utah, in your testimony today, and you've listed Utah communities as among the most upwardly mobile in some of your writings. Now, in my experience, there's a Moscow in Idaho, there is a London in Kentucky, there's even a Newark in Delaware, but there is no other Provo. Nonetheless, there are some communities like Provo where upward economic mobility is possible. What is it that you found in your research that differentiates Provo and communities like it from other communities where you don't see that kind of social capital and economic opportunity?
Well, thanks for the question. So I will preface this by saying I have not actually been to Provo, Utah. So I will, but I can tell you,
have to remedy that.
But what I will say is, when we look broadly across the U.S., in places like Provo that have some of the highest rates of upward mobility, what we find is really the four characteristics that I mentioned in my testimony. It's places that have strong schools. It's places that have less residential segregation and less income inequality, places that have stronger measures of social capital, and places with stronger family structures. Now, what is it about a place in particular that drives its high rates of upward mobility? That's a question to which we don't know the exact answer. But in a place like Utah, the fraction ways of measuring social capital, two things sort of come to mind. It's a place where a wide range of measures of social capital score highly. There's a high fraction of religious populations there, and in the U.S. more broadly, we see that places that have a higher fraction of people who are religious, we do see higher rates of upward mobility. We also see places that have people that return their census forms have higher rates of upward mobility, speaking to some of that civic engagement. And so this, I think you phrased it right, that what we see is something amorphous that is hard to really put a finger on what exactly is driving the high rates of upward mobility. But what we can say are there are these characteristics that do correlate more broadly across the U.S.
I found it interesting when you mentioned in your written testimony that there are some poor neighborhoods in Provo where children raised in those neighborhoods, by the time they're 35, are earning $60,000, $65,000 a year. There are other neighborhoods where that is not the case. Are these same correlators present or absent in one neighborhood or the other? Are those the same things that differentiate one neighborhood within the same town as one town from another?
Yeah, exactly. And I think it comes back to the statements earlier. Across the U.S., metro areas that have a higher degree of things like residential segregation or lower measures of social capital have lower rates of upward mobility on average. When you zoom in within a locality, what you find is the children growing up in these segregated neighborhoods tend to have lower rates of upward mobility, or conversely, in places where measures of social capital are lower, those are places that have lower rates of upward mobility, even within cities, if that makes sense.
Oh, thank you. That's helpful.